Okay, so thank you very much for coming to the second workshop that Helen and I and Katie Mills have been delivering. This is number 2 in a series, and Helen is going to start off by talking about literature reviews in general. But the whole purpose of this session really is to look at the way in which writers position themselves within their texts when they start to bring in other writers. So this isn't about how to cite, but it's about citation practices, which are quite different, and looking at resources that we can use in our own writing and resources that we can use to help students develop the way in which they position themselves alongside the scholarly literature.
Okay, shall we make a start? So thank you everybody for coming. And the first thing we wanted to flag up as well is that these sessions, they're not about us being the experts and telling anybody how to write, what to do. They're more about developing and engaging in some academic discussions about writing. And in this case, we're looking at writing in terms of writing your lit review. So we want to try and generate some discussions about how we write and the nuances of how we write and how we use references and how using references affects the way we write. And it's probably fair to say that it's a neglected area. It's quite an advanced area. When a lot of our students, it's something that we don't go into deeply. So this is a really nice opportunity to actually think really carefully about the way that we do use literature in our academic work. And Marion's got some really interesting examples that we can look at really closely. Before we do that, we've just put together some slides to kind of put this in context. And you're OT specialty, aren't you? So we've got nursing and OT here. So it would be interesting to see what differences there are in different specialties. What is a literature review? It's probably fair to say that this is going to be different in different disciplines. I think between OT and nursing, the similarities are huge, so I don't think there are big differences. And actually, the more I think about it, the differences are kind of nuanced across all the different disciplines, but there are some differences which is useful to think about. Generally speaking, I think we can say that a literature review falls into 3 categories. And from that I mean the standalone study, of which obviously Cochrane and Campbell collaboration lead the way in terms of rigour, but they kind of put that method right in the centre of what a standalone lit review is. You're aiming to find out what we know about a particular topic, and it doesn't lead on to another study. It's a piece of work in its own right. So I'm going to say that's the first category. The second one I wasn't quite sure whether to add in there, so we can have a bit of debate about that, is the scoping study, where you are kind of looking to see what's out there, but it's not a full literature review. It's more of a sort of look and see. You don't do nearly as much with the literature that you find in a scoping study as you do with either of the other 2 lit reviews, which is why I was kind of reluctant to put it there, because it hasn't got that same academic rigour as the other 2. So whether we call it a lit review or not is a matter for debate. And if there are other disciplines here, it'd be quite interesting to see what people would say about whether they would call it a lit review or not. And then the third one is probably the classic thing that people think of as a literature review. It's that review that you write as a prerequisite to an empirical study. But I've added in there, or an extended argument, because not all studies are empirical studies. Some people, especially in other disciplines, will construct their academic work more in terms of an argument, and they will have a lit review prior to that, just as much as we would prior to an empirical study. So I've put that in. Any thoughts on whether we would include the scoping study as one of our 3? Is it an imposter, or should it be there?
we have it there as an option for MSc students.
Even for an MSc, yeah. Because strictly speaking, a scoping study is only a search. It's not.
So a scoping review. This is how we have it. We worded it.
Yeah.
A scoping review, and we follow more or less the same rigor with whatever we find, but we are going on to more concepts and not a specific question like the lit review.
Okay, so it's a very, so it's not a focused, it's more broad.
It's more broad, yes. This is how we
Yeah.
take it.
Does it still count as a lit review then? When it says, or what distinguishes it from an essay? Go on, man.
Yeah, I think, well, I've seen some scoping reviews published in nursing literature, and when I looked at them, I can't tell, is this really a review or an essay? It's, and the reason...
in education, scoping reviews in education.
It depends how systematic the searching was and the way they presented these findings. And
You see, by definition, it's not systematic, it's more of a function, isn't it? We want to know what's out there. It does depend, of course, there are different types of scoping reviews as well.
So what about those scoping reviews which are just looking at, for example, the role? What's out there? What are OTs doing? What is the role of OT? So again, scoping for and get abroad.
Yeah.
And a lot of pieces of evidence.
Yeah.
I think it's more to understand.
And then you get more concepts. They deal with that. They deal with that.
Yeah. You see, I don't know if I would even call that a lot of it is semantics, and when you look at sometimes I sort of scan the other disciplines just to see what's going on, just out of interest. And people say, oh, we don't do any systematic reviews in whatever it is, art history. Then you go to an art history journal and you kind of find they're doing very, very similar things to what we're doing, but they're using different terminology. So that means, so you've got to sort of try and unpick what people are doing. And I kind of come to the conclusion that there's far more common ground than sometimes we think there is, but sometimes the terminology is used differently. And it can throw, because for all lit reviews, you're trying to find out what's out there, what's been done before, that's in relation to a specific topic. Possibly with a scoping review, the scope is broader than for the other two, maybe answer a more specific question, but for these two, the scope is...
Yeah.
But as I'm aware of the time, and we've got a limited time, but that's just a sort of... Those are three categories which I think probably capture most of the work done in lit reviews. So, and again, and this is tentative because I'm whether this applies across the board. Generally speaking, a lit review would have a method, or in other words, a logical way of identifying relevant literature. Now, in some disciplines this is explicit. So in healthcare, I think we're really far advanced. I might be biased. I think we're really far advanced in making that explicit. If anyone went to the Posters in Parliament display in April of this year, it was the poster display that it's a cross-university thing, and adult nursing and health were really well represented, and our posters were second to none. They showed really explicit methods when students were describing how they'd done their projects, which were often literature reviews. So the lit review should have a logical way of identifying relevant literature. Normally that's made explicit, but not always. Sometimes it's implicit. So if you go to some of the some journals, when it's a lit review prior to an empirical study, they will have a lit review. In those studies, they don't often give you an explicit method. You just trust that they've done an explicit method. If you go to a Cochrane or a Campbell standalone study, they will give you a very, very explicit method. And when you publish your own lit review, like Mamdouh has done, you have to publish as well a very, very explicit method. So it varies the extent to which the method is published. It also varies the extent to which that method is made explicit or it's implicit. And I think in other subjects, more arts and humanities, that method is implicit. Whether they're on the same trajectory towards making the method more explicit, I suspect they probably are, but who knows? But certainly in the sciences and in nursing and in health, the trajectory is to make that method very, very explicit. And that then is distinguished from the narrative review. The term narrative review has become almost pejorative in healthcare. It kind of implies a review that isn't systematic, that's just a collection of ideas. And it's generally not deemed to be a high-quality review, and it's deemed to be difficult to distinguish from an essay. But does anyone have any thoughts on that? Do they still have a role in...
Well, a meta-narrative review has a particular framework, doesn't it?
Yeah, meta-narrative does, yeah. It's more just when they say narrative review on its own.
Yeah, I would say the same thing.
So what's the difference between meta and narrative?
Well, meta-narrative is a specific approach to doing a lit review, of which we've now got loads and loads and loads of named approaches, and they would have a specific method. Whereas a narrative review, it's really hard to find anyone telling you what that method actually is.
Okay.
Is it more descriptive then?
So it's the narrative of the writer, really, then, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. And we used to think that was absolutely fine until we started developing this much more rigorous method for doing a lit review. So it used to be the norm, really, and now it's become not the norm.
So the narrative of the writer, from whatever reading he has done.
Yeah, from their perspective.
Selectively.
Wow.
And it could be an argument, could be a discipline thing, couldn't it? It could be something that you're particularly interested in, or school of thought, or...
And what we've done in health is we've that scholarly narrative of the writer, we've kind of taken that away a bit, haven't we? In our effort to find rigour, rightly or wrongly.
Well, it's this tension between the objective and the subjective
It is.
all of the time.
Yeah, it is.
Actually.
It is. Yeah,
and that's
really
an
interesting.
issue in writing, full stop, because we're very focused on outputs, but we're not always very good at helping people to actually write.
Yeah.
So then how does that narrative, how does it differ from an essay? Because you do more or less the same, you do your reading and then here is you construct the argument as you want.
Yeah. But you don't know with an essay if it's fully inclusive, if people have just cherry picked their arguments and written a great essay and you don't. Whereas with a review, when it's got a clear method, you've made that process really, really explicit.
But an essay has a different function, doesn't it, to a review? An essay is about developing. It's about developing, and it is a mechanism to demonstrate that you can write an argument. For sure. And there's a school of thought that says we're not doing that enough with our nurse. There is a school of thought that we're not doing that enough in nursing. Yeah,
because it's and in addition to that, it's such a great learning tool, isn't it? Yeah. When you write, you learn. Go on.
If it's an area where there is not much published literature or something, it's difficult to do a proper systematic review.
Yeah, for sure.
Well. So in that context, is it acceptable to have a narrative? Will it be considered equivalent?
Yeah, you would, and you would say that there was barely any literature on this. However, what we do know is this. For example, you could say that.
I'm wondering how confusing the whole process is for students.
I think it is.
It's confusing for us, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Because the first thing they need to think about in their dissertation is the literature review, to start to understand the topics, to be able to find the gap.
But I do feel, personally, that having these frameworks for literature reviews might be helpful to people, actually.
I think so, yeah. Or at least clarity with what the concepts. Because it's not helped me. Marion and I had this discussion this morning. We were looking at a lit review from an undergrad dissertation, but it's called a background. It's called an introduction. It's not called a lit review. So even from then, there's confusion over what people are doing. Is it just a background? Is it a lit review? and it's a lit review prior to a lit review, so that's even more potentially confusing.
Yes, but you said again about the terminology and the context that you use it, because you have exactly the same. If you write a journal article, you will have the background where actually you've done some literature review on that topic.
Yeah.
But you call it background.
You do, depending on the journal.
Yeah.
And so which is why I think it's so important that we've got some sort of conceptual clarity, because so that people know in their own minds what they're doing. They're not told by other people. That you've got to understand the sort of academic rigour in what you're doing and be able to defend it, rather than be told by a journal, well, you need to call that introduction and that, because there is potentially. And then I don't know if you'd agree with this next one. If it's a review of empirical literature, so health is dominated by empirical literature reviews. So we set a question, we want to know what the answer is, and we go to what's been observed, what's been looked at in practice. So because it's essentially a practice discipline, we want to know the answers from practice. So it's essentially 99 times out of 100. You're looking for maybe 9 times out of 10 you're looking for empirical literature. Now, because of that, we argue for a comprehensive search so that you don't miss anything out. But when it's non-empirical literature, if you're searching for theories and concepts, we're not saying you can't possibly have a comprehensive search because you'll never finish. So you are selective. And that's an approach that's that's a kind of different kind of an approach when you are writing up a review. And we're probably more focused on the first of those, the empirical.
But if you have scoping review, you will have...
You will.
Yeah.
You will. Yeah.
And we are asking our students at the moment to do a comprehensive, a systematic search, even.
Okay, but will they get it though?
One of the issues that I've had when I've written reviews myself is that when you have, ideally, your systematic review or the systematic approach, you'd have criteria and you'd exclude studies that were of lower quality. And for some of the areas that I've looked at, you'd end up with no literature.
Yeah.
Because there isn't high quality.
Yeah.
There isn't high quality literature out there. So one thing that our discipline do not do very well is writing about educational interventions. They tend to call them evaluations, and they're quite quick and dirty, and they're not really.
Yeah.
But in order to write a review, you have to write about that and the quality of that and what's in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in a way, they're kind of, I don't know. I mean, some of the literature it's on. I don't know whether you would really even call it empirical, because it hasn't necessarily been studied in a systematic way.
Yeah.
But you have to include it.
You have to include it, probably.
Because it's about the culture of the discipline.
Yeah,
it is.
It
right
is.
Now.
And we were really challenged on this with a student that Thomas met when he was looking at literature that had been created and had been designed by people on receiving personal budgets. And we were saying, well, it's not published in the, in fancy journals. He was saying, look, if you exclude that, you're silencing all this knowledge and work that's on an air. And he was right. We had so that what you include and what you don't include it needs really sort of clear methodological decisions. So before you've even come to the writing, there are lots of things to consider, but I think the main thing is developing that academic conceptual clarity about what you're doing, so that you can argue. And the nursing literature isn't known for its conceptual clarity. It's not. There can quite often be confusion in terms that are used. So I think it's really, really important to sort of work out what the terms mean and work out how you're going to use them, and then stick to that. Over to you then, Marion.
Okay, thank you. So, bearing in mind the metaphor of a party that I gave to you, one of the things that maybe isn't always, definitely not explicit to our learners, and maybe we're not explicit about it, that writing is a social act, and when we write something and we externalise that writing, we're trying to join a conversation. So we're trying to join a conversation as nurses, as OTs, within our own discipline. And I don't know what you think, has that occurred to you before?
No.
No. So it requires consideration, and it requires quite a lot of skill. So one area, and it's not, I don't think it's drawn on quite enough, is this concept of intertextuality. And basically, you can't really write an academic text without relying on other texts. Is that a fair comment?
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about intertextuality, what we're talking about is the relationship that a current text has to surrounding text. And Rosa Varnick, who's sadly no longer with us, but has written a lot about her perspective is that writing is about identity, and it's about developing our identities, and it's very often about becoming something. And I think the further you go up the sort of educational levels, from undergraduate to postgraduate research, that becomes more of an issue. You're definitely becoming something other. So she argues that we should she has argued that we should make this more explicit for our learners, because it's this whole concept of intertextuality. It's relevant to writers' identities in two ways, because they need to position themselves into the highly valued convention of quoting from authoritative sources. So not only have they have to cite those resources accurately, they have to take a position in relation to those resources of agreeing, disagreeing, evaluating. And secondly, the practice of intertextuality requires the writer to echo and align themselves with the voices of others, but it does mean that they have to develop their own voice, and that is a big challenge. It's almost there's almost a tension when we're saying you must cite everything that you write. There's almost a tension, it almost stifles the writer's voice, but development of voice is really important. So what intertextuality is participating with our own voice in the dialogues that are established within a disciplinary community. So that involves making a contribution, having a discussion, synthesising, paraphrasing, or reformulating what other authors have written in the past. So arguably, these workshops are concerned with academic research writing, so the writing that you write in dissertations or thesis. So in a document like that, you're citing throughout the document, but particularly in the literature review, that obviously is the most richly cited aspect of a thesis or a dissertation. So they come from linguistics, and these are the different types of ways in which we can cite. So the most obvious way of citing somebody is to actually directly use their words. So we imply transmission of other authors' ideas quite literally. We're using a quote and we're transmitting those ideas as we think that the author intended them to be. So for the writer, there's quite a lot of cognitive demands associated with that, because quoting the words of others involves quite a complex reconstruction process where you're analysing the quoted context, so you're analysing what the writer meant, and then you're trying to analyse the context in which you want to put those words. So it is more than just cutting and pasting, or it should be more than cutting and pasting.
If it's done well. But then there's duplication of words, in my opinion, that if they just paraphrase in the first place, wouldn't that be more effective?
Well, I think we have a tendency to argue for that in healthcare because it's a good practice, isn't it? And really, there isn't, but sometimes there are just those I don't know, those quotes that...
I placed this in my methodology. There are some concepts I couldn't paraphrase, and if I paraphrase, the meaning would be lost. So I kept it as it is. Direct quotes was perfect in the methodology.
But did you explain it? Did you therefore then show the reader that you understood what that meant? Because that's the problem we have when marking, is that if there's just a quote, then there's no demonstration of understanding for me that it meant.
You should always explain following every major quote. So this is a wonderful book by Graf and Birkenstein, and I think it's in its 6th or 7th edition. It's in the library, it's available online, and it's got lots of really helpful templates for writers. And one of the chapters is on about how you introduce quotations, and then you should always say afterwards, you should always express, well, I don't know, is this up for debate? But you should say what you understand by that quote rather than just stick it in and hope for the best.
That's good with the context.
So these are just some examples that I've taken from that text. So I would recommend, I think it's a really useful textbook. And it's particularly helpful for people when they're starting out to write something and plan something and building their confidence as a writer. It's a bit like, has anybody used the Manchester Academic Phrase Bank? Have you found that helpful?
Very helpful.
Yeah, they've got some good templates. I just think this goes a bit further they're very good on the macro structure of writing things, but I think this is much helpful on the micro structure. So the next type of citation is what's called the indirect integrated citation. So you're not including the author's literal wording, but you're giving much relevance to what the author is saying. You're bringing that author's voice into your text, and your voice remains in the background, focusing on paraphrasing of other contributions. So there's an example. Tharp considers that schools need a reform with the following objectives: excellence, equity, inclusion, and academic harmony. So you're giving credit to the person that you're quoting, and you're providing a definition or you're providing the reader with what you understand by what that person is offering. Now, none of these are right or wrong, I have to say, because there are certain parts of the text where citing in a different way has most relevance. So this is the most common type of citation, which is the indirect, non-integrated citation. So you move much further away from the cited author's literal wording because the author is included in brackets afterwards, and the ideas or information referred become a separate part of our own discourse. So your text comes to reflect the cited author's voice. But it can become very problematic when people use a lot of, we'll cite 12 people or something. They can't possibly be all saying the same thing. So this is an example of an indirect, non-integrated citation. So in that case, the citation refers to a particular meaning of the therapeutic relationship and indicates the readers how they should interpret it. So that's a better example of an indirect, non-integrated citation. So ideally, you'd hope that a text would have a mixture of these types of citation practices. So once again, from Graf and Birkenstein, some helpful ways for writers to make it clear who is actually saying what, because sometimes that meaningfulness gets very much lost in the text. Would you agree?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's really common that people just get misquoted,
Yeah.
isn't it? Really common.
So, indirect citations of an evaluative kind, when we evaluate what we're citing, our degree of closeness or distance or agreement or disagreement regarding the cited author's ideas. So we're making evaluative comments about what we are citing. So we can have evaluative indirect non-integrated citations, or we can have indirect integrated citations, and they can both be an evaluative kind. Does that make sense? So there are some examples there on the slide. So this is just more from Graff and Birkenstein. Now there's very often, I'll go back to that in a minute. So very often I find there's disagreement between different disciplines and different individuals about the kind of words that you should use when you're being evaluative. Now, what I'd like you to do next, I've got some examples. There they are. I've got 6 copies. How many? Which are taken from a range of different texts, and either working in pairs or on your own. Ignore activity 3, I didn't get that far. Identify what type of citation practices the writer is using. Just conscious of the time, shall we have a discussion? So, what did you think about number 1? What examples were in there?
I've put there was a bit of everything, I think. Yeah. I think I've got one of everything in there.
Any advances on that?
But a lot more of the last one.
What?
Indirect citations of an evaluative kind, but I might have been misunderstanding what that means.
Yeah, I found more of the direct and indirect, but not so much of evaluation.
Right, okay.
Same here. Yeah, I think more direct, indirect, integrated citations than
The evaluation.
they very much. Apply.
Well, I mean, as we said, there are no right. What do you two think?
I suppose I was more thinking about different things as well. I was kind of thinking, without the original text, it's really difficult
Yeah,
to,
of course.
isn't it? So it's which is I know that's something I'm going off at a bit of a tangent, but you just can't. People get misquoted all the time, don't they?
Yeah.
And you're reliant, but the nearer the person stays to the text, the more likely it is to be an accurate representation.
And is it a responsibility of the reader to decide?
No, it's for the writer.
Exactly.
It's the
Yeah,
writer.
you can't possibly know
But-
everything, can you? But
And the other thing I was thinking about, I don't know if you're coming to this, but when you come to journal articles, because they're so authoritative, they have a tendency to do this 10 people thing, don't they? And because it's a journal article, it's a kind of it feels like a stamp of authority, it must be right, but actually, like you say, did those 10 people really make that point?
But presumably the reviewers, the peer review process, it would go out to reviewers who know that literature and would know.
would hope so.
Yeah.
Because very often when you get reviews, you get, well, I'm surprised you didn't include blah, blah, blah. Or,
but then that does leave a margin. It does leave a margin for error, doesn't it?
Well, you have to trust the writer, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, I thought, just at face value, I thought it did have a bit of everything, and definitely I felt there was evaluation in there.
Assertive. So my interpretation of the evaluation was to kind of summarise what the findings were.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot of quite assertive
Yeah,
summary statements I found that were referenced, but kind of
yeah. But this is undergraduate writing, so
yeah.
Okay, what about number 2?
Oh. Actually, I might have been confused. I'm sorry. I got loads more ICE. I'm sorry in that one. I labelled mine. I'm sorry. I got a lot more of evaluation in that one. Again, I got no direct quotes in that one. Maybe I was. No. I think I merged the two together by accident. I still found a lot of evaluation in there.
But for me, I find that they don't necessarily show their agreement or disagreement. These authors are saying this, they are saying that.
It's quite descriptive then, isn't it?
I
What
cannot
do you
see
say?
the voice of the person who wrote this. So that's why for me, I don't know exactly then where is the evaluation from. So I see a lot of
I know what you
they
mean.
know what they're talking about, this person said that, this is the argument, but I don't see
Yeah.
the voice of the author.
Yeah, I
It's
understand.
like list of references and sources attached to each
Are
other.
they building up an argument with facts?
And yes,
Yeah.
they are, but then I don't know whether if this is what evaluative means. Is
Is
it
this a
enough?
full paragraph, Marion, taken as it
It's a
is?
full paragraph, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's important what Helen said, we're not seeing this in the context, and I think the difference is that perhaps I don't think this is empirical data that this person is talking about. They're not talking about empirical literature,
Exactly.
they're talking about policy
It's like
and...
background.
Yeah, and it's very hard to be evaluated because they're facts, aren't
They
they?
are just facts. Building up an argument.
Yeah, and you do want to see that at some point
Yeah.
in a dissertation. So it's
Yeah.
But if they're pulling out the correct facts,
yeah.
would that make it evaluative? If they're
But-
concluding effectively?
But I'm looking at the definition, and it's
Well,
it
you
says-
could say in the broader sense they're being evaluated because they're evaluating the current position of something professionally, legally, politically,
Yeah.
perhaps, if it's building up an argument.
Yeah.
And presumably this is very much... this is the sort of thing that you would know this anyway, wouldn't you? You presumably know this literature from community.
Me,
know-
yes, yeah.
So
Yeah.
you would
No,
make
this is,
a
I
far
don't think this
more
is
of a-
about community programmes, this is about a community. For me, I interpreted this as a community of students rather than community students. So if you're referring to me as my health esteem role, I interpreted this more of a community, a sense of belonging. That's how I interpret it.
I think it was about student nurses' experience with, out in the community,
Oh.
actually. But you haven't seen the whole
Third
thing,
one.
so... No. Okay, what about the journal?
Okay, I'm with you, yeah.
Number 3.
There were some direct quote. There was a direct quotation, wasn't there? But there was.
And there's a lack of
Some-
quotation as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't it? It's not surprising that such attitudes exist as prejudice persists in society at large.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's definitely there's someone's voice coming through there. Would you say?
Yeah, here for me, this was a bit more voice.
Yeah. But it's very clear, or it's clear to me anyway, or you might disagree, that this is somebody who's very confidently speaking to a discipline or a community of people that will know, because you're citing a lot of people without saying what those people have
Yeah.
actually done or
Yeah.
said. So it's
And-
very authoritative.
It is, and that's what I think. If you read that is the style of how they're often written, and I think that sometimes prevents people from. Hopefully, the reviewers know, but I think you get away with stuff by just writing in that way. And
Do you think that happens because people are usually condensing a larger body of work
Yes.
to publish,
yeah, I think so.
and they want to
yeah.
squeeze as much in as
Yeah.
possible?
Yeah, you are very, very reliant on the integrity of the writer.
Or that there is a lot on. It's a big problem for everybody's talking about that. So
Yeah.
when you have
Mm.
If it's a trend
6
in the
authors or
Exactly.
Yeah. It's a much easier way to write, isn't it? But you know, when I've been writing it and you think, right, I can get away with this, I can write this off hard, it's a much easier way to write. Because no one's questioning you, you're saying, this happens, and these are the people that... It is...
Well, it's like the driving test analogy. You know, when you're learning to drive, you've got to show the instructor, is it mirror signal manoeuvre?
Yeah.
And you sort of have to do that as a student, which you don't have to in,
Exactly.
in
Yeah.
journal
Yeah.
articles.
Yeah, because with our students, and Marion and I had this conversation, we encourage our students to talk about the sources they're using, so put that evaluation explicitly in the text. It's clumsy, and you might take it out before you submit it, but it makes you think about what you're using. So the exact opposite to what these guys are doing here.
Yeah, and goes back to that point that writing is a tool for yourself. Writing acts on the writer as well as the
Does
the
that become
audience.
an opinion piece then, when it becomes so
That could be an opinion piece, actually. couldn't it?
one-sided in a fashion? Well, not one-sided, but when it collects so many ideas, it becomes less robust, but it definitely reflects the opinion of somebody. Do you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, I've written a series of commentary pieces for a journal, and I had very explicit instructions that I was only allowed to cite X amount. I was only allowed 5 citations. So then that kind of limits. That's up to my, isn't it then, my kind of discrimination about what I'm going to. And they didn't question. I've done it twice, and neither time have they questioned what I've cited. So, what about number 4?
Non-integrated, integrated, we have some. And
I don't know what the last one would be.
quotation, there is some quotation, direct quotation.
This level 7
Oh, sorry, I'm at
dissertation.
5. Sorry.
Oh, that one, sorry, yes, I was on the same one, I've moved.
Interestingly, if you weren't wondering why there's no brackets around the 2014, that's the APA style of referencing. So it's not a mistake. American Psychological Association, which is used in a lot of American nursing journals, but this was actually psychology. This is an example of a master's psychology dissertation. But what did you think?
It's easy to read, but sounds like more textual and more descriptive than. But I know at the same time saying other words ended up that paragraph with really good statements.
I think, they give as well the
Evaluative.
I thought it was evaluative.
Oh,
I thought they were evaluative. They were saying what the limitations were of the source.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was
Yeah, just
quite
not
clear.
as concise, but yeah.
More evaluative, this one.
What about number 5A?
I
This
put
one has a direct.
indirect and direct, yeah.
And then it's
Sorry, indirect, integrated and direct.
and the quotation.
Yeah, direct. I'm not familiar with, obviously, theses I am, so I don't know if is that normal practice to be so, that last in the B part of it. And then you're talking about A, aren't you, at the moment?
B, yes, I was going to ask you what you thought about B. What do
I
people
just
think
don't know
about B?
Is that normal practice to be?
What do people think?
It makes me a bit uncomfortable.
What they're saying, if one had time to read the...
Well, yeah, if you've got time to read this, you'd agree with me. I found it a little bit assertive. Yeah.
Very informal as well.
So therefore, if you don't agree with him, then you've not read it properly and it's your fault. I kind of felt it's a bit uncomfortable, but is that normal?
Well, I'll tell you where I got it from. I got it from education, and I'm doing my PhD in education, and to write like that is quite common. I was absolutely shocked
Really?
when I first started.
Were you as well? Oh,
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because I'm quite opinionated then.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've actually been told to take citations out.
You have been.
Yeah.
Phew.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
they're
it's
stuck a
in-
lot, aren't they? We're
So it's
too
in-
controlled, aren't we, in our It does feel uncomfortable,
I
doesn't
think
it?
we're ahead of the game, like I said to you about our posters. Here, our faculty one stood out.
Right, I'm just very conscious
Yeah.
of the time. Do we need to go? I was just going to. I've got one last slide, which if you're interested. This is from my. For my PhD. I'm looking at writing development, and I'm looking at writing development of master's dissertation students, and also when they go on to write for publication, and also staff staff who haven't written for publication before but who do. So as part, but I'm not making any inferences here because I did a qualitative study, and I tracked these people over the whole year of their dissertation. So I had examples of their writing, and I interviewed them, and I also observed them in the workshops and recorded their conversations. So I've got quite a lot of data on how their whole conversations changed about, the vocabulary that they were using about writing. But I did just because they made claims about how their writing had changed. So I was very interested in how their referencing practices changed over the years. So this is just a sample from 5 of them. So this is at the beginning, number 1, and number 2 is at the end. So the number of citations, with one exception, obviously there's more citations in the final piece of work. There's no surprise there. Very few of them include direct citations. And if they don't, it seemed to me they don't, and there was no real difference from beginning to end. Their non-integrated citation levels were greater at the beginning, and their integrated increased, and so did their evaluative citations in most cases, which I thought was interesting.
Is it percentage? What are the figures in relation to? I'm so sorry. Is it word count or what percentage?
Yeah, I counted how many. I actually took their literature review chapter and counted, because I couldn't do the whole 20,000. Okay. So it's the actual number. It's the actual raw number of how many they included. Okay. But I think it's quite interesting because one of the things that I found is that students are very wary. They love anything that helps them structure their writing, but they're very wary about putting their own voice into their writing. Yeah. So
undergraduate students.
These are postgraduate, yeah.
And
because
they've been through.
It's probably because of previous messages they
had.
Yeah,
that's what my interpretation might be of that.
Yeah, you won't do this, you mustn't do that, and in fact, as we were saying at the beginning, there aren't rules as such. It's principles that guide. But if they've been taught as rules rather than as principles, they won't be able to.
I think with large cohorts of undergraduate programmes, it's easier to give a clear single message. When smaller programmes, you can work with people to develop them a bit more. But certainly our students
but a lot depends on also, which is beyond this. A lot depends, particularly for our students. What other infrastructures they've got around them, like what happens in practice, who talks about research, who they can actually go away and talk about their writing, who they can share their writing with. But one of the things that was quite interesting for some of them, as they did develop their voice more, they gave their writing to other people, they were aware of the feedback that people were giving them because of the response that they'd prompted in the reader, if that makes sense. So they became more aware of putting their own voice into the writing and how that affected their reader, negatively or positively.
But I don't know if it's the same in OT, but in undergrad nursing, we just don't teach this.
No.
We just assume that people pick it up along the way.
And then if they come back as postgraduate students, you're assuming that they know what they're doing, and they don't. We have to start from scratch.
And I don't think you have
enough OT. Sorry, do you teach this in OT?
No, we don't.
No, we don't teach it.
No. You just do when dissertation.
You assume it's assumed to be sort of craft knowledge, isn't it?
I think it's taken for granted.
But this is what I've been teaching in the dissertation writing workshop. So I have been teaching it. But it's voluntary, so it's not mandatory.
Yeah.
So it's up to it's up to the students, their motivation, but whether or not they're available to come to the sessions, because you can't.
But also, because we haven't given the message in the rest of the programme, You know, it's almost, you know, feels like an add-on, whereas actually
Yeah.
should be integral.
Integral to modules.
Yes. And I mean, I'm not the module leader for the dissertation, either for undergrad or master, but if everybody's coming from the same kind of angle, more people should be here, and the dissertation supervisor. Because this idea of students' own voice, I feel is a little bit of a subconscious, no, you don't have a voice yet.
But no one can explain why. Because it's not
yeah.
explored, really.
So yeah, everything what the students state, okay, who said that, so that there isn't a student
There isn't
voice.
always a lot of time in supervision either. It really depends on the student. I mean, if you've got a student who you're giving a lot of feedback on their content, then you have less time for this.
And
if you've got a student and their content, you're happy with the content, then you can
only then do you get there. Yeah.
you can devote time, and you know that they're going to understand what you're asking them to do. There are some students that I don't know whether I would feel comfortable in. They're welcome to come to a workshop, but I don't know,
Because
you're pushing them outside of their zone of proximal development, if that makes any sense.
And it might be more apparent to us than to you, Marion, because you're so immersed in it. But this is quite advanced. You might think, I think this is actually quite advanced stuff, and like you say, a lot of undergrads don't get near it.
But it's not. I think it's not taught in British universities.
No.
But if in the US, you have to do a composition module as part, not as a remedial thing. I know it's happening a bit here now, but I think it's remedialising writing. It's not saying that everybody needs help, and I think everybody does need help.
I
with
think
their
everybody,
writing.
and what we do, we send to the student support to help with developing arguments and
we give it to someone else, don't we? We don't
upgrade.
skills,
Yeah,
we don't
go to
do
them.
it.
But there is an
And against
argument for
remedial.
writing in the disciplines, which is a movement, it's quite a small movement in the UK. That there is an argument that it needs to be done at disciplinary level, because that's how the discipline itself develops.
And
And
it's
for a young
discipline.
discipline, I think that's really, really key, actually.
I think it should, and I think this, if we would teach more of this, then the problems of students who come from different backgrounds, where building an argument or defense.
I think what we have to couch it as, just looking at university faculty objectives, that it's part of assessment and feedback. That's how I would argue that we have to couch it, perhaps badge it like that.
Although it doesn't quite fit not well in there, does it? But maybe we could add assessment, feedback and writing development.
But we do a lot of, even though we're a practical discipline, most of our assessments are writing based.
So then we need to do more teaching on it. We will assess it.
Anyway, thank you very much for coming.